Okay, I think we are ready to go. Thank you everyone for joining us for today's virtual event, Nature Talks, Conserving the Buzz. This evening you will learn why bumblebees are important, which species are in decline, how habitat affects their survival, and what you can do to help bumblebee conservation. My name is Sean Fagan. I am the Communications Coordinator at the Nature Conservancy of Canada, Alberta region, and I will be your moderator today. I'm located in Calgary on Treaty 7 territory, the traditional territory of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Stoney Nakoda and the Tsuut'ina Nations, and homeland to the Métis People Region 3. At the Nature Conservancy of Canada, we know our work across the country is on the traditional territories of Indigenous people. As an organization, we are committed to reconciliation. We do this by seeking Indigenous counsel, listening to, learning from, and collaborating with Indigenous communities. I invite those of you streaming live with us today to use the comments function to let us know which ancestral land you find yourselves on. If you're not sure, one helpful resource is the Native Land website, nativeland.ca. Okay, might be a shy group today, but that's okay. So for those of you less familiar with the Nature Conservancy of Canada, we are a national charity that conserves nature. Our mission is simple: protect and restore Canada's most important natural areas and the species they sustain, so nature and people can thrive. Since 1962, with the help of our partners and donors, we have protected 15 million hectares, or 37 million acres, from coast to coast to coast. This evening, we are looking forward to a captivating presentation by Tiffani Harrison, Ontario Program Coordinator for the Native Pollinator Initiative at Wildlife Preservation Canada. But before we begin, I would like to cover a few housekeeping items. Today's virtual event is being recorded. We will be sharing a link to the recording after the event, so keep an eye on your inboxes. We welcome you to revisit the content and share it with colleagues, friends, and family. We also invite your comments and questions. At the bottom of your screen, you will see a Q&A icon. If you have a question at any point in the presentation, just type it there and we will answer what we can at the end. Lastly, if you're on social media, you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and also TikTok. Use the hashtag NCC Nature Talks and share your thoughts about tonight's webinar. At this time, I would like to introduce our guest speaker, Tiffani Harrison. Tiffani joined Wildlife Preservation Canada as a bumblebee conservation technician in 2017 and fell in love with the work. Since then, Tiffani has worked a variety of roles, leading monitoring surveys, research projects, and community outreach, both in Ontario and Alberta. Currently, she manages the fieldwork and community outreach components of the Bumblebee Recovery Program. Tiffani completed her Master's in Environmental Science in Conservation and Biodiversity at the University of Toronto and comes from a background of ecology and conservation biology. Thank you, and the floor is all yours, Tiffani.
Thanks so much for that kind introduction, Sean. I'm really happy to be here, and thanks to everybody else who is here as well. So I will get right into it. So today's presentation is called Conserving the Buzz, which Sean already had mentioned. And again, my name is Tiffani, and I am with Wildlife Preservation Canada. So Wildlife Preservation Canada is a national nonprofit, and we have the mission statement of saving animal species at risk from extinction by providing direct hands-on care. So we have a variety of programs across Canada, and each one of our programs has some sort of hands-on component with the species we're working with, such as head starting or conservation breeding. So on the screen here, you will see a variety of species. So these are the programs that we have, some that exist in Ontario as well as BC. So species that we work with include the yellow-banded bumblebee, which is kind of my focal species I work with under our Bumblebee Recovery Program. But also in Ontario, we work on the Massasauga rattlesnake, which is Ontario's only venomous as well as rattlesnake, and that's where kind of I'm from. We also have our Eastern loggerhead shrike program. And then out in BC, we focus more on the Taylor's checker spot butterfly, the Western painted turtle, and the Oregon spotted frog. So as I mentioned, I do work under the Bumblebee Recovery Program, but that's kind of a smaller branch of our native pollinator initiative, which began in 2013. So we have a couple programs under this. So on the butterfly front, as I mentioned, we work with our Taylor's checker spot butterfly. So that's a program we have in BC, and that is a species that is endangered and once thought to almost be extirpated from Canada. So we've been doing conservation breeding as well as releases on Denham Island for a few years now. More recently, we've been working with the mottled dusky wing in collaboration with other partners, and that species is also endangered. So last year, in collaboration with other partners, as I mentioned, we helped do the first monitoring, as well as the first reintroductions in Ontario for the species, and that was the first reintroduction of a butterfly in this particular area. And we've already seen resightings of adults this year, so really exciting news. On the bumblebee front, which is more kind of my close to home, we work with all bumblebee species really across Canada. Again, our bumblebee recovery program is more based in Ontario, so primarily with Ontario species, but we have had work done in Alberta as well. So in the top left here, you'll see the rusty patch bumblebee. So if you're not familiar with that species is federally listed as endangered. And that's actually what our program was initially developed around. We wanted to monitor and conservation breed the species and eventually reintroduce it across its historic range here in Canada. However, we have not been able to find individuals of the species since 2009 at Pinery Provincial Park here in Ontario. And as you can imagine, it's very difficult to run a conservation breeding program, nonetheless monitoring a species if you can't find any individuals. So unfortunately, we had to switch to a more closely related species. So in the bottom left here, you'll see the yellow-banded bumblebee. So that species is also federally listed, but a much lower level, at just special concern. But it is closely related to our rusty patch bumblebee. So this species is kind of the focal species that we do most of our work on, particularly in a conservation breeding aspect, but we do monitor all species. When we work in our Alberta range, particularly here out west, we focus more of our efforts on the western bumblebee, which is federally listed as, it's only been assessed to be threatened by CACIBIC, so it's not quite listed yet, but might eventually get there. So bees, so that's what we're here to talk about today, more specifically bumblebees, but just a little background on bees in general before we hone in on that one particular group. So there is a huge biological diversity when it comes to bees. It's quite astounding. There's actually more than 20,000 species in the world. So I know there's usually a lot of birders that I meet. So for every bird species that you can think of, there are 2 species of bees. Looking a little bit more to just North America, we're looking at about 4,000 species. Further towards Canada is about 800. And then where I am in Ontario, it's about 400 species. So incredibly diverse. I know a lot of people think they, the honeybee and even bumblebees, but there is just an incredible diversity, just even beyond I could ever personally learn or ever get the chance to even encounter. Another fun fact, most of our native bees are actually solitary. So when I speak to a lot of people doing outreach, I find a lot of people think most of our bees live in that typical colony. There's a queen, there's workers, it's very large. But that's actually not true for most of our species. Here in North America, that's really only true for our bumblebees, also true for honeybees, although those are not native here to North America. But actually most of our bees are solitary. So we have individual females doing all the work just themselves. So kind of like their own little queens, but they don't head a colony. So quite fascinating. So bumblebees actually are kind of the outcasts. They're kind of an out group, which is quite neat. Another fun fact on top of that, just to show how odd being social is in the bee world, there are actually more parasitic bees, about 13%, than social bees, which is about 9% in the world. So by parasitic bees, I mean bees that steal resources from other bees. So that's more common in the bee world than actually living in kind of a social structure. So just to kind of give you an overview, what species you might think of or bees you might think of or already know that might fit into one of these social or solitary groups. So again, our social list is quite small here. We have the honeybee as well as the bumblebee. So both have that kind of social structure, living in a colony. There's a division of labor. But most of our bees, again, that you're probably familiar with are actually solitary. So bees such as sweat bees, carpenter bees, mining bees, mason bees, leafcutter bees, and other cuckoo bees. Most of those will fit into this kind of solitary category. And again, looking at our social bees, most native bees are solitary. So our only kind of truly eusocial bee here in North America is the bumblebee. So getting more into the diversity of bumblebees. So some of you might actually be surprised to learn that bumblebee isn't actually a single species. It's actually a genus, so that's called Bombus. So here in North America, there's actually about 49 species of bumblebees, and that number kind of slightly shifts as time goes on and we do more research. But we have a variety of colors, sizes, different tongue lengths even between species. So it's actually quite fantastic. You have species that have mostly black abdomens, mostly yellow, orange, red, brown, and even white. It's really incredible once you get to know the bumblebee diversity around you. So kind of to give you a kind of starting point, trying to think of a reference point even for what a bumblebee might look like. I find people sometimes mix them up with honeybees, but once you see them side by side, you're like, of course, I know that's a bumblebee. So on the left here, we have the honeybee. So typically they're much more narrow in terms of their general size, but particularly their abdomen, and just thinner abdomen altogether. They're not nearly as hairy as a bumblebee. There will be hair on it, but definitely not nearly as much. They're typically much smaller, especially compared to bumblebee queens that you typically see quite early in the spring and into early summer. They have much more of a traditional striped abdomen, and the coloration can differ. You might see honeybees that are quite yellow, some that are a little bit more orange, and some that are even brown. And then if you're thinking of colonies, so less about the individual itself, honeybees have quite large colonies, could be 60,000 workers in there, and they persist all year long, and an individual queen can live multiple years. Now to compare this to our bumblebees, so we're thinking much larger, hairier throughout their whole body. So you'll see hair all the way down their abdomen, even if it's black. They are typically much larger in size, especially the queens. Quite a bit more color varieties I just mentioned. There could be white and orange, red and brown. And this color change can be different even within species. They typically have a much larger thorax. So if you look in this photo here, that's going to be the really bulbous part behind their head. That's quite a bit larger than what you see on the honeybee here. And then in terms of a colony, bumblebees actually only have annual colonies, which we will get into. So that means everybody kind of just lives within that same year, and queens won't live multiple years. So unfortunately, even though we have a great diversity of bumblebees here in North America and even just Canada, unfortunately, quite a few species here are at risk. So on the screen here, you'll see some of the species that have been assessed or are currently federally listed to be at risk here in Canada. So as I already mentioned, we have the rusty patch bumblebee here. So currently federally listed as endangered, very likely extirpated from Canada already. So its only Canadian range was kind of in Southern Ontario. And again, we haven't seen any individuals since 2009. So not a very great story. We have our Western bumblebees. So that'll be more kind of your local species in decline if you are coming from Alberta. We have our yellow banded bumblebees. So again, that's kind of the focal species that WPC works with here in Ontario, only listed as special concern, but we also have been using it as a model species for those more endangered species, such as the rusty patch. We have the American bumblebee, which was recently assessed to be special concern in 2018. So it's not federally listed yet, but it may potentially be listed in the future. We have the gypsy cuckoo bumblebee. So this is a really interesting bee you might not hear much about, but it was listed around the same time as the rusty patch bumblebee and has a really unique story. As you can see in the name here, it's a cuckoo bumblebee, and you probably know cuckoo from other taxa like cuckoo birds, but our cuckoo bumblebees will steal resources from other bees and actually kind of take over their colonies. And the gypsy cuckoo's favorite host, more or less, was the rusty patch bumblebee. So as the rusty patches decline, so as the parasitic bee that follows it. So that species is also federally listed as endangered. And then another cuckoo that's also in decline, but has a little bit more variance in the hosts that it utilizes, is our Suckley's cuckoo. So this one isn't federally listed yet, but it is currently assessed to be threatened, and I think is up for reassessment quite soon. So if you are out west, more towards Alberta, these are the species you could find in your area. And if you are more towards the east, such as in Ontario, where I am, these are the species that you would find in your area, or could, maybe hopefully, but you're in that range. So I already mentioned that bumblebees have annual colonies, but I'll go through a little bit of the colony cycle because I find it quite fascinating. So in the early spring, you will see bumblebee queens emerge. So these are the really big, hairy bumblebees. They're quite large. You notice them quite well. So they've actually been overwintering since the previous fall or late summer. So she will begin foraging to start bulking up. She's pretty hungry. She's been sleeping for quite a long time. So that primary responsibility is to put a little bit of weight on her. Then you will start seeing her look for a nest. So she's going to want to find a safe space to raise a colony. So she'll spend quite a bit of time checking out different areas. It could be thatchy grass in your lawn. It could be rock piles. They love empty rodent burrows, anything like that. And if you're ever looking or following a bumblebee queen in the spring, and she's looking for a nest, she'll do a very interesting zigzagging pattern around your lawn. She's not looking at flowers. She's on a very concrete mission to find a very safe space to raise her colony. Once she finds a space, this is when you will see a bumblebee start collecting pollen. So as you may know, bumblebees, as well as honeybees, this is kind of unique to those groups, they will collect pollen on their hind legs. So bumblebees have a specialized structure called a corbicula, or a pollen basket that they can actually groom pollen off their body onto, and they will pack it onto their leg. So once you see that a bumblebee queen is carrying pollen, that's an indicator that she's found a safe place. She's kind of started that colony initiation cycle, because imagine if she's collecting pollen, she wants somewhere to bring that back to. So she's not going to do that unless she's already found a spot. So she'll begin collecting pollen and she'll start laying her eggs. And once she lays her first brood, these will be workers, and they are also female like the queen. She'll remain in the nest, so she won't do any more foraging. Her now goal is to just continue to lay eggs. And now the workers, again, so those are females and typically look like just little miniature versions of the queens for the most part. They'll take over those foraging responsibilities. They might help keep the nest clean. They might keep the nest cool. They might fan it, and they might help incubate brood, among other activities. So usually around, early to midsummer, and in particular as you progress into summer, you'll begin to see that switch outside of queens to now worker bumblebees. And then as you progress further into the season, now looking more into late summer and to early fall, although it seems to be getting earlier and earlier every year lately, you'll actually see males being produced as well as new queens, which we call gynes. So these are unmated queens. So starting with males can look quite different from their female counterparts. They typically just leave the colony. They don't have anything to contribute. They're just there to mate with queens of the same species from other colonies. So you'll often see them just kind of out and about and lazing on flowers and kind of watching for these gynes from other colonies. And then these kinds that are produced, so these new queens made at the end of the cycle, they hang around the colony for the bit. We're not too sure how long they're there, but then again, they're going to bulk up just a little bit before they go into their hibernation, or what we call overwintering. And just like finding a nest, this particular queen now is going to look for somewhere to hibernate or overwinter for the winter. So she's going to spend a while trying to find that place. And often it might be just nestled under leaf litter in your own lawn, potentially. So here is a photo of what a colony looks like on the right. So much messier than what you might think, especially if you're familiar looking at honeybee colonies. So quite a bit messier and has kind of a more capsule look to it. So these kind of lighter, whiter capsules have currently brood in it. So they're incubating. You'll often see pollen kind of piled around here. And then these little capsules that kind of look cut off, and you'll see that kind of glistening sheen. That's what we call nectar pots. So bumblebees will pool their nectar in there and keep that in the nest, so that if bumblebees are thirsty in the nest, they don't actually have to leave the nest to drink. That's already available to them. So it's really interesting how it looks. And much smaller colonies can really depend on the species. It still could be, a few hundreds of workers, but nothing like the thousands and thousands you would see in a honeybee colony. On the left here is just a nice photo of these tri-colored bumblebee gynes that I actually got to monitor when I worked out in Calgary. So they were hanging outside the nest, and it was really cool to see, because I had been monitoring that site for a while. So when you are seeing those gynes produce at the end of that colony cycle, that's a really good sign that that colony was successful ultimately. So getting a little bit into the work that I personally do in our bumblebee recovery program. So we have a few components. We do quite a bit of community science, where I train volunteers, so people just like yourselves, how to survey bumblebees just like I do, how to identify them, and ultimately contribute valuable data to Bumblebee Watch, which is an online community science platform. We also do a lot of education outreach, so webinars such as this, ID workshops, tabling events, anything to spread the word about bumblebees, bees in general, and how you can help. We also do a lot of research and monitoring. So as Sean mentioned, I kind of lead quite a bit of our field work here locally in Ontario. So we run annual Queen Spring surveys every year. So we have a variety of sites across Ontario that we go and visit in the spring. And we will collect bumblebees, look at kind of species and abundance. And ultimately, we collect queens from the field of certain species, so such as our yellow-banded bumblebee, which I mentioned, and we will actually put them into our conservation breeding program. So we will put some of these queens into our lab, we will raise them in captivity, monitor them over the summer and the fall, try to mate these queens as well as overwinter them. So getting into why bumblebees, why do I focus on them? Why does WPC focus on them? And why will you absolutely love them after this presentation? So unfortunately, the first reason isn't great. Bumblebees are globally threatened. So we are seeing about 30% of bumblebee species might be at some risk of extinction on a global scale. It's more about 26% here in North America. So definitely not good news. We have a few that are about critically endangered all the way to vulnerable. We actually have just nearly as many species that are at risk are also classified as data deficient. So this is where there's not really enough we can learn, or there isn't enough research, and it's difficult to do research on these species to assess kind of where they're at. Maybe they're too rare already, maybe they were already rare to begin with, but it's difficult to kind of assess. So that's not really great news either, unfortunately. Now, I know you're wondering about the threats. There are quite a few. There are multiple drivers we think that are driving this decline here. So it isn't kind of just a one hard-hitting thing, which makes it difficult. And all of these threats are also interacting with our species differently. So some are doing absolutely fine. Others are definitely getting hit a bit harder. But some of those threats are things like habitat loss. So both loss of, foraging resources, so flowers, as well as nesting resources in that general habitat. Of course, pesticides, so agricultural chemical use. So those can affect our bumblebees in different ways. And there's a lot of research going into that currently. Things like parasites and pathogens. So this is something I find a lot of people don't realize, but bees can actually get each other sick. So this can be from commercially managed bumblebees, which if you didn't know, bumblebees can be commercially managed just like honeybees. And if those bees escape, they actually can infect other bees if they happen to be sick. And this is also true with honeybees. Honeybees can also spread pathogens as well as parasites to wild bumblebees as well. So this is something we have to keep a really close eye on and manage well. And then, of course, climate change manifests itself in a variety of ways. That could be changing the bloom time, increase of drastic weather events, causing species to shift their ranges. So that's manifesting itself in a variety of ways, as I mentioned, and that's something that a lot of research is going into as well. So another reason you want to focus on bumblebees and why you should love them is truly they are excellent pollinators. They are great at what they do. And there's a few reasons why this is the case. So one is they are quite generalist foragers. So some other bees aren't out as long, so they specialize in quite a group of flowers, or if they've just built a really good relationship with a certain group of flowers. Bumblebees pollinate quite a few things. They don't have a wide preference. As I mentioned earlier, some bumblebees differ in tongue lengths, so they could be short versus long. So some bumblebee species can access different flowers better from each other, so it might seem like a little bit of a preference. But generally, they do pollinate quite a wide range of flowers as well as crops. Furthermore, they're what we call kind of early and late foragers. So they're out really in the season, about April for some species, and they can be out as late as even October for some other species. So it's true that they're out very early in the year as well as late in the year, but also early and late in a single day. They're up really early out foraging, collecting that pollen. And I've seen bumblebees foraging as late as almost 11 p.m. on a nice day that's still sunny and warm. So they're just absolutely always working hard. And then it comes down really to their basic biology. If you've seen bumblebees, they're typically quite larger, especially the queens. They're extremely fuzzy, much fuzzier than most of our solitary bees. So with that large body and that dense hair, they just passively spread that pollen really, really well. So even if they're not intentionally trying to do it, they do it very easily. That pollen gets picked up on their body, and as they go from flower to flower, they're spreading that around. And then another great thing about our bumblebees is because they're a native species, so, they've evolved here over a long period of time with our native fauna, or flora, sorry. And so they have these really specialized relationships with some plants. So for example, something that bumblebees can do, and some other species of bees here, but not honeybees, they have this pollination technique called buzz pollination, or sonication, you might know it by, where they can essentially shake pollen out of a flower that kind of holds it really tightly. They use their really strong flight muscles to do so. So you can hear them buzzing on a flower, and that's really efficient for certain crops, such as blueberries, and some crops actually need that for pollination. So what can you do to help our bumblebees? How can you get involved? How can you contribute to bumblebee conservation? Well, there are a few ways. So one of them is community science. So community science is invaluable to research and conservation programs such as ours. Luckily, bumblebees are relatively easy to ID in photos. So we ID them mostly by their color patterns on their thorax as well as their abdomen, whereas other bee species are much smaller and it can be quite difficult to ID without a microscope. So by people taking photos, actually, they can contribute to community science quite easily, and I'll go through how to do that. As you can imagine, researchers are limited by time, personnel, funding. So even just myself, I can't be everywhere all the time, nor anybody else in my program, unfortunately, as much as I would love to be surveying bumblebees every day, all year. But having people such as yourself and any volunteers to help fill in those gaps is really invaluable to us. So volunteers can help increase search effort and provide site-specific data and help contribute long-term data over time. And of course, it's a great opportunity for engagement. So we do have a few community science programs, like actually in person. So if you're from Alberta and you're close to Cochrane or Calgary, we currently run a program in partnership with Glenbow Ranch Park Foundation at the Glenbow Ranch Provincial Park. So you can sign up for surveys and conduct bumblebee surveys over the summer. So if you're interested, you can reach out to them or reach out to me and I can pass you along. If you're in Ontario, we have two currently. We have one at Pinery Provincial Park, which we've been running since 2015. Same concept. And then more recently this year, we just implemented one in partnership with TRCA, which is a conservation authority at Claremont Nature Center. So if you're not near any of those, have no fear, you can contribute to Bumblebee Watch. So this is kind of like an iNaturalist, but specific to bumblebees. So you would go online to the website or the app. You would submit photos of just bumblebees. So you can submit multiple photos of just that one that you're seeing flying around your garden. There's an interactive ID guide to help you identify the species and make a tentative guess. So you don't have to be a bumblebee expert. And then somebody like myself will actually go verify the species and tell you what you are seeing. So this is really great because it helps us assess the species, monitor species ranges, support policy discussion, as well as guide overall conservation strategies and actions. So submitting to Bumblebee Watch is quite easy. You just need those photos, a location, the date that you saw that bumblebee, as well as the flower if you'd like to put that in. And our last two things that you can do to contribute is feeding the bees and housing the bees. So if you have any sort of landscape, pollinator habitat is super crucial. So you can start a pollinator garden at any scale, between window boxes, flower beds, garden plots, to as large things such as farm fields. All of them are useful. But you want to make sure that you're planting things that are going to have seasonal long blooms. As I mentioned, we have species out as early as April and colonies that might last from September or till October even. So try to make sure you have something consistently in bloom throughout the season. You want a variety of colors, shapes, and sizes to reach different species, even further more than just bumblebees, but other bees in general. And it will definitely benefit many other pollinators. And you want to focus on those native species. Unfortunately, some ornamental species are kind of more pleasant for us than they are pollinators. They might be complicated to get into, or maybe they're not actually nutrient rich for our native species here. So you want to focus on the native species when possible. So if you are interested, on our website at wildlifepreservation.ca, we do have a nice poster here that you see here with different suggestions for the flower, depending on the season. So this was made kind of for the rusty patch. So this is more Ontario based. So some of this might translate out west, some of it might not, but it might be a good starting resource for you. So moving from feeding the bees, housing the bees is also a great option. So you want to resist perfection. It's a really easy way to have the excuse of not even raking your lawn. So leaving leaf litter, long grass, mulch, thatch, they love all of this. And having any undisturbed, shaded, and well-drained areas and sandy areas will be beneficial for many species, not even beyond bumblebees again. As I mentioned before, bumblebees need a safe place to both build their nest and have that colony throughout the year, as well as over winter. So these could be things such as empty rodent burrows, decaying logs, tree cavities, thatchy vegetation, rock piles, and kind of fine, brittle, fine plant material for other species, also useful. So again, a great excuse to not rake your lawn or do too much yard work. So if you don't have too much room to plant, maybe you can at least provide some nesting places for them. All right, and that's all I have for you. So thanks so much for listening, and I'll pass it back to Sean here.
Well, thank you, Tiffani. That was an incredible presentation. And also thank you for your passion and dedication working to conserve this totally lovable group of insects. So now it is time for our Q&A. If you have a question, don't be shy, fire it in the Q&A slot at the bottom of your screen. And we'll get through as many questions as time allows. We'll start out. John Geary has a couple great questions, so thank you, John. The first one being, is the bumblebee life cycle in a perhaps warmer place or a place with a different climate like Vancouver any different than, say, in Alberta?
As far as I know, no, not here in North America anyway. They are still annual colony cycles. But something I don't know too much about, to be honest, and I'm always pretty blunt when I don't know something, is I'm not quite sure how much it differs in areas where they don't actually experience winter like we do. I'm sure that is some sort of the association here. So it is possible they might persist longer in some other areas of the world, but across here in Canada, it's relatively the same. Just species emerge at different times and go into overwintering at different times. So that can be different between species.
And you mentioned that some bumblebees are managed commercially. So what are they managed for? Another great question by John Geary.
Yeah, that is a great question. So typically our managed species, we only do one here. It's the common eastern bumblebee. So hence the name, it is quite common out here in the east. But unfortunately, we do ship it across North America. So we are shipping it to regions of Canada where it actually isn't found, such as in BC. So that's also another issue we're trying to monitor very closely as they can escape. So typically they are used more so for greenhouse pollination. It's a little bit more difficult to put them just kind of in a crop field like honeybees. You can't manage them quite the same way when they're out like that. Maybe honeybees might be a little bit more reliable in that kind of open freedom sense. So usually it's for greenhouse pollination.
Interesting. I have a question from Marilyn Brown. Hello, Marilyn. Marilyn asks, a lot of people live in apartments or condos. How high up do these bumblebees fly? Would they be attracted to a flower pot in a balcony high up, maybe 4 to 8 stories? I think that's a great question. Yeah. And it's nice for all people to have a chance to help these bumblebees out of their home.
Yeah, that is a great question. I have almost always lived in a condo building, so I haven't had the pleasure of having my own pollinator garden, maybe one time in the future. I honestly can't answer on how far they might go up. I do know quite a few people who do have things on their balconies that are fairly high up, even just when they grow their own little herbs and stuff, maybe not even flowers that some bumblebees do like. So I have seen people do that and it be successful. But that's where there's the alternative option of maybe you're going out on a walk and you're taking photos of bumblebees. So you don't need to have those plants. You can still contribute in a few other ways. So I can't answer that super specifically. I think you can still give it a try and see. Bumblebees are quite robust. So you do see them in quite high elevations is the word I'm looking for in different regions. So I wouldn't say it's not possible. So I think you should give it a go and see. And if not, there's a few other ways that you might be able to contribute. But I feel you on that. I wish I could provide a bit more space myself.
Interesting. Lindsay Murphy has a question. Hello, Lindsay. Thank you for joining us. Do bumblebees make honey too? And I guess you touched on the question of why are they raised commercially? Yeah,
so they do technically make sort of a honey. It's a very small amount. And it's nothing like what you would know as honey from honeybees, nor taste like honey from honeybees. So it is relatively the same kind of substance, but again, much, much smaller quantity. They don't produce it in mass amounts like honeybees do, and it's still not quite the same as what we know honey to be.
And Faye Douglas has a question. Would bees, I guess bumblebees, ever use a birdhouse perhaps as a nesting place?
Yeah, that's actually happens quite a bit. I know sometimes people, you're expecting birds and you're like, what the heck, there's bees in here. So we have actually done quite a few projects with kind of artificial boxes, but we do find the more time that a box spends outside, the more time it gets weathered, and the more times it actually gets used increases the chances of something like a bumblebee nesting in it. So very possible that can happen. Whether it happens year to year is a little hard to say, but I have seen quite successful colonies raised in a bird box.
Interesting. I have a question from Stephen Dang. Hello, Stephen. Stephen says that he sees different bumblebees out at different times of the year. Do different species have kind of different timing of emerging, establishing colonies, and overwintering?
Yeah, they definitely do. So here, again, I'm more Ontario based, so my knowledge is a little bit more specific to that, but we do have quite a few species. So where I am, for example, we have the two-spotted bumblebee. So that's going to be one of the first species you see in my area. And then we have other species like the northern amber bumblebee here. So again, two-spotted maybe comes out fairly early in April. In the last few years, it seems quite early springs. Whereas our northern amber bumblebee, for example, comes out sometimes early to mid-June. You don't really see a peak of it until later. So it can be quite different by even 2 months. So of course, if you're starting your colony earlier, you're going to produce those guides and males earlier, which means they're going to overwinter earlier. So it can be quite a different cycle time-wise, depending on the species.
Okay, interesting. Lindsay Murphy has another question. How do these unmated queens survive the winter? Do they freeze solid or hibernate, or how do they survive?
Yeah, that's a great question. I haven't looked too much into overwintering. It's not quite my area. And actually, the amount of effort still trying to go into researching overwintering is quite difficult. As you can imagine, it's very hard to find a queen that's kind of nestled herself into leaf litter. So it's incredibly difficult to study in the wild, never mind even in captivity or in a lab. So they do go into a much kind of slower metabolism, kind of like a diapause that a lot of other insects might do. But we still don't know, how much does she need to eat beforehand? If she's potentially infected before that, will she carry that on after that overwintering? What weight does she need to be to overwinter successfully? So these are all things that people are looking into, but it's really difficult to study. But I also wish I knew these things.
Yeah, well, I think that just highlights that there is such complexity out there and so much to study. So it's great that we have researchers like you working on that. Terry Lacroix has a kind of cute question. Terry had a couple little bumblebees that live in a hole near her house, and that they kind of disappear around this time. So what are they doing? Are they forming colonies, or kind of why might that be?
Yeah, so they're not like honeybees in the sense where they might swarm and divvy up the colony at a certain time of the year. As I mentioned, they are annual colonies, so there is a natural die-off point. Typically, I wouldn't say it's this early in the season, but I'm also seeing productions of males and guides this year much earlier than other times and other years I've worked with them. So usually you will eventually see, less and less, especially if you've seen, actually where the nest is, and you can kind of monitor that a little bit. But workers, if you think of workers that might have been produced, in May or June, they might have already reached their time already. You might see that kind of lingering off in that colony in general. So it's probably not something worrisome. The only time I'd ever be worried is usually if you're finding dead queens. But if it's males or workers that, just don't look so great, they might look very worn and kind of balding. They're just old and they've been out a while. And unfortunately, that's just part of the natural process for them. But if you're finding those much bigger queens, those shouldn't be dying. You shouldn't be seeing those. So that would be a little bit more issue of concern. But otherwise, unfortunately, they're probably just heading out for the season.
Okay, so we still have a couple great questions. We have about 2 minutes left. So let's do a little lightning round.
All right.
Elizabeth asked, do any bumblebees migrate?
Not that I know of. As far as I'm aware, they only ever go so far from even their nest. When foraging, it's about 1 kilometer. I think you can go up to 3. So even when they're looking for an overwintering spot, it's usually fairly close, I would imagine, from their original spot, and even potentially the spot they already were in. Because you have to imagine they already were safe there, so they might actually overwinter there. So as far as I know, no.
Okay. Teresa asked, do the male bumblebees die after they mate? And she's noticed some kind of sluggish bees occasionally.
No, they don't die after they mate like some other species. For that, it's because they kind of get ripped apart. So they actually can't survive mating. For male bumblebees, that's not true. They can mate with multiple females. Again, they don't live for very long though. So they might just kind of be sluggish because of that. Their primary purpose really is to just be out and mating with those queens.
Okay. Kathy asked, does Chinook weather hurt the bees? I guess in the winter time, if these bees are in the ground and the temperature heats up rapidly, can that hurt a bee? Can that cause mortality, that sort of thing?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I definitely remember learning a lot about Chinooks when I worked out in Calgary. So I've asked actually a lot of researchers this question myself, especially when you have those early springs where you're like, it's spring, and then it snows again, and you're like, it's not spring. So I have learned they can relatively go back into that same kind of state and should more or less be okay until it warms up again. But of course, like many of our species, they do take a lot of environmental cues for when they go into hibernation, out of hibernation. So I think it is something that could kind of cause a mismatch over time. But as you probably have seen, lots of bumblebees are very successful out even in Calgary and Alberta going through that weather. So your particular species might just be maybe more robust and more locally adapted for things like that than even Ontario bees. But from what I know, they're still okay. But I also worry about that because you just never know.
And Faye Douglas asked, thank you, Faye. Hello. How can we help the bees in this extreme heat cycle? Certainly it's hot in Calgary today.
Yeah, that is also a tough one. When you're out, when it's quite hot and humid, it's been very hot in Ontario recently, you'll definitely start to see the numbers and that kind of abundance drop off. So they might forage earlier in the day or later, still just making sure those resources are available. I know out here in Ontario, most of the landscapes are pretty barren actually, because not many species of flowers are growing because it's so dry. So still being able to provide that when you can and just having that available. They'll get out and forage when they need to, and they are quite adaptable. So if they're only around, when it's 30 degrees all the time, they're going to have to go out eventually. But if it's kind of 1 or hot 2 days, throughout the week, they're going to be really precise about when they're going out to make sure that foraging is really efficient.
Great. Well, that was a great group of questions. I do have to ask one of my own though, and sorry if I put you on the spot a little bit, Tiffani, but obviously it's alarming seeing that some of these bees are declining and have been assessed as at risk. I'm wondering what things give you hope in terms of the future of bumblebees?
Oh, that is a loaded question. I mean, for me I've been with this organization for a while, so I've seen, this program really evolve over time. I've been on the ground the whole time doing the survey. So even I myself have seen, shifts in ranges and populations in just my 5 years that I've been doing this. But we are still finding species and we're finding ways to, locate these rare and at-risk species and monitor them. We're still working really hard to kind of perfect our breeding protocols with the real genuine hope that we're going to be able to reintroduce species such as the yellow banded across its historic range here, likely in Ontario when that happens. So hoping to bump those numbers eventually. Unfortunately, I can't say that's going to be the case with the rusty patch. Probably not, but still hopeful that maybe that may happen one day. But I think just being on the ground and being so ingrained in this program at this point and seeing those developments, and we're making progress with monitoring and finding sites and building teams, that I'm always hopeful about it. And I just always know that it just always feels like really rewarding work. And, to look back and knowing I was on the ground making as much as an impact I can feels really good. And I definitely feel like we've been trying to make a difference since I've been here and in general since the program's inception. So it is true, working with species at risk can be difficult and isn't always optimistic, but you as a person have to remain optimistic. So it's a great question, Sean.
All right. Well, yeah, as I said, just thanks so much for all the work. And, I believe in that rusty patch bumblebee. I think it's going to come back here. So I think that's all the time we have for questions today. If you did have a question that didn't get answered, we'll try to answer it via email. And thank you everyone for who joined us and the excellent questions that you did have. I think that was a really great session there. So for updates on future NCC webinars and events, check out our events page at natureconservancy.ca/events. Together, we play an active role in survival of species at risk and habitat conservation in Canada, whether it's donating to your favorite conservation organization, whether it's lending your time to volunteer or empowering others to become conservation leaders. There are plenty of ways to make a difference. When it comes to species at risk, including some of the bees Tiffani highlighted, one important way we can have an impact is by conserving the habitat they need to thrive. Species with habitat and well-managed conservation lands generally face fewer threats than those living outside them. Over the past 60 years, NCC has protected 15 million hectares of habitat for 236 of Canada's species at risk. When we reduce threats, we reduce the risk of extinction. In time, actions such as habitat conservation, restoration, caring for lands, and raising awareness can improve the status of at-risk species. This weekend, there's another way to support conservation, and that's by participating in NCC's 3rd annual Big Backyard BioBlitz. Go to backyardbioblitz.ca to sign up and follow the instructions to download iNaturalist. And then just get outside this weekend and be part of a nationwide community science project. And maybe you'll spot some of the bees Tiffani mentioned. And I've talked to a couple entomologists as of late, and they say that these programs, just everyday people just taking pictures with iNaturalist, captures relevant and important data for science. So you really can make a difference that way. Thank you for spending the time with us tonight and for caring about nature. Stay tuned for the link to today's webinar recording. You'll receive that in our follow-up email in the next few days. And on behalf of all of us in the Alberta region of the Nature Conservancy of Canada and Wildlife Preservation Canada who joined us to speak today, thank you and have a wonderful evening. We hope to see you next time. And thanks again, Tiffani.
Thanks so much again for having me, and thank you everybody for being here and your great questions.
And happy bee watching, everyone.